CFR Network, CFR News. Good day, good night to all. Welcome back. Thank yourself, most importantly, for tuning into the broadcast and most definitely for surviving the zombie apocalypse and the current state of affairs. Another special guest, returning guest, author, critical thinker, researcher, Andrew Johnson. Welcome back to the broadcast, sir. How are we?
Thanks for inviting me back. I'm very well, thanks. Yeah, all things considered. So pleased and happy to be here.
Excellent, excellent. And the sun is shining, luckily. I mean, we are allegedly in summer. We've actually got a bit of sun as well. So how about that, Andrew?
Absolutely, yeah. I've been fortunate enough to do a five and a bit mile walk this afternoon. So cross fields and things. So that was good for the soul.
Excellent.
And yeah, so as many buzzards as people. So that was good.
That's always a note to being in nature when you see more buzzers than two-legged people.
Right, yeah.
It's always good to sort of ground yourself in nature, depending on where you are. And many people are in a sort of metropolis. That connection with nature gets more and more divorced. The quicker and quicker. So wherever possible, get into those green spaces, especially now that, we are getting a lot more dry weather and stuff. And, I think aren't we supposed to be getting potentially 40 degrees next week or something?
I doubt it'll get up to that. I think it's meant to get up to like 29, I think. But the way the weather forecasts work, I don't know whether that'll, pan out. But we'll see. I mean, it's certainly, when I lived not long after we moved into this house where I live now in 2003, it got up to 37 here. I distinctly remember that 37 degrees centigrade. That's the hottest I've ever seen it in this part of the country here. I live in the Midlands.
Yeah.
Who knows what happened?
Definitely. I mean, you've got a little bit more hills, so I guess you might get a little bit more breeze.
Potentially. I mean, we're in the sort of southern Derbyshire where I live, so it's much. I'm in the Derwent Valley, so it's a lot more low lying there. It's not very not many hills near here, so
we'll cope. I'm sure we will.
Yeah.
Fans, windows open.
Absolutely.
Hydration, coconut water, and all the rest of it. So yes, looking forward to that. Trustfully. It will manifest to be a nice time. As I say, temperature-wise, as everyone knows, you just got to look out the window every day and see how the weather is. We can't rely on these predictive weather patterns, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, one of the things I've talked about, I can't remember whether I talked about it with you last time, is that, there is what you might call man-made climate change, but it's done using covert technology. And if anybody's not familiar with that, then you maybe want to try and have a look at what happened on 9/11. And you can see some of that information on my website, CheckTheEvidence.com. And I've written quite a lot about that based on what Dr. Judy Wood uncovered all the way back in 2008. So there's a lot of important information there, which still, many people are just not aware of, but it's easily discoverable if you know where to look for it.
Exactly. And just from the people also think that this is like I mean, we're definitely in a more of a modern age, but when they necessarily think about weather modification and cloud seeding, they're thinking of really high-tech means to achieve these ultimate goals. And as we discussed before, it's as simplistic as a huge balloon filled with certain sort of minerals and stuff to elicit certain reactions from clouds.
Yeah, some of it is. I mean, that's the early stuff that was developed in the 1940s. But what I'm talking about is something that you won't really find much public information about. It's all in the black world, and we can establish that from studying various types of evidence that have become available, through various researchers over the years. And, there's also a kind of a disinformation trail as well. So if you know what to look for in the disinformation, that can sometimes sort of give you some clues as to where to look for the real information, as it were, where to try and, dig down deeper and see if you can find, the truthful information, so to speak.
Yes, for those who have the inclination and also the time, and
Right.
actually doing that by going down these rabbit holes, it builds up a sort of methodology of how to get to the truth. Because as you say, you come
Yes.
across a lot of stupid stuff initially, but then when you start to you test it to see if it's true and you verify it, and then you look at other sources to verify, and it's like actually, yeah, I do have a method of uncovering a certain level potentially of truth. It's just again, how much time are you going to invest into it?
That's right. And I mean, what I've come to realize is that there are a lot of narratives that are being put in place. And this happens not only in what I call the shame stream media now. I don't call it mainstream. I just call it shame stream because, particularly over the last 2 years, it's absolutely shameful that what they've done and how they've betrayed everybody. But you get all these narratives put out in the shame stream media, but you also get alternative narratives put out in the alternative media. But those narratives themselves are not totally truthful. They may be slightly more truthful than what's in the shame stream, but nevertheless, you still got to try and do more research. And I mean, particularly with the 9/11 information that I referred to, I've written 2 books about that very thing, that you got the mainstream, you got the alternative, and then you got the truth.
Yes.
And I think what both within the alternative media and within the mainstream, and of course this goes in degrees, but I came up with this expression, which is based on what you would say in court. And in court you're supposed to say, I promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me whatever, help me God, or some people are firm and don't mention God. So I came up with this: what happens with people like, for example, James Corbett, who's a well-known researcher.
Yes.
People like Dame Wigington, who talks a lot about geoengineering. I can apply this to him. Richard Gage, to a degree. I can apply it to David Icke as well. And the saying goes like this: I promise to tell some truth, some half truth, or anything but the truth. And parts of that apply to all the people that I've mentioned. I go into that in more detail in my 2 books about 9/11, if anybody wants to read that. With quotes and evidence. So I'm not just sort of, I'm
hypothesizing.
I'm not hypothesizing. I'm not trying to cast aspersions particularly. I'm just trying to point out to people that once they get out of the mainstream, shame stream, they still need to be on their guard. That just because they've come out of that, not everyone else is telling the truth, so to speak.
You've said it very well, sir. I mean, another, because before I even give the example, it's almost like you have these clever people who see, as the Americans say, the niche or the niche within the market and say, you know what, I'm kind of interested in this area. Let me put out something that has got some truth to it, which you can verify. But I'm also going to put a load of my speculation. I'm going to put a lot of titillating bits of information in there, some real shock value, and I'm going to start to sell products.
Yeah, I mean, there is that element to it. And, certainly, as we know, there are a number of authors that sell a lot of books. They'll have a subscription-based website.
Yes.
So you which can work in various forms. You either have a login and you pay £2, £5, £10 a month, whatever it is, to get newsletters or the latest videos they've uploaded or wherever it is. Which is fair enough. I mean, some people are doing that, I think, ethically and for good reasons. They everyone needs to eat, etc. But in other cases, I think they are trying to deliberately build up a following. And I've noticed this with a couple of researchers, that their following and their fans, seems to be more important to them than the actual truth. Checking that they are still being truthful and still maintaining, a truthful basis to what they're saying. It's far easier to think, well, I've got a large audience and everyone listening. I've got all these people listening to me, so that's more important to me. And of course, for me, that's never really been that important. I mean, it's great when people listen to me,
of course.
And I have, my YouTube channel has got, I think, 16,000 subscribers, which I'm quite pleased about, since
Definitely.
I haven't done anything to sort of do that. To get that, I haven't made any particular efforts. But what I was going to say is, I think the real value of that to me is that within that quite large number, there are quite a few people that actually comment on the videos, and they make good comments. And then they email me and they send me good links. And therefore, that allows me to, further go down those rabbit holes and get more evidence, or, improve my own knowledge based on what they found out. I mean, an example of that was happened in the last sort of 2 or 3 weeks. And we're going to go off into a bit of an area here because for some people, but I think your program has covered some of these areas.
Yes.
And this is to do with essentially consciousness topics. You might want to call it spirituality as well.
Yes.
Now, a good few years ago now, back in 2004, I was informed about this site called the Wingmakers. And you can go and see this at wingmakers.com, or if you go to another website, wingmakers.ws, you will find all this material about, the nature of being human, what it is to be a conscious human being, and how, the conscious human being works. And it is claimed that this knowledge has come from this, what's called the central race, this race of beings who actually, played a hand in creating humans. And, so they're basically aliens, speaking plainly, these aliens, came to Earth and they started messing with the genetics here over millions of years, essentially, eventually creating humans. And now at this time, essentially, they've realized that, we are in a bit of a fix. And so they planted a time capsule. And the Wingmakers story, which is on this website, sort of goes into this mythology. They stated that it's a mythology, and all of this. And they say that there were these chambers, and these were discovered in the 1970s, I think. And then that knowledge was passed to a group within the NSA, and this labyrinth group, this is named within the NSA, the National Security Agency, that is. And then out of that, they came and developed this, they called it the ACIO, the Advanced Contact Intelligence Organization. And they were handling all this material to do with the Wingmakers and stuff. And, you read this and think, oh, that's a good science fiction story. That sounds like a really good plot for a science fiction film, And they don't actually claim that this story is true. However, when you actually read the materials about, for example, what they call a sovereign integral, and how the sovereign integral is essentially what a human being embodies, and how the soul is carried in the body, and how the soul interfaces with the body, and all of this, what you find is some very concise and actually very powerful information in there, which, of course, and I've recently been discussing this with somebody who's much more clued in than I am. It ties in with, the concepts of things like Hinduism and Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, and all of this. There's a very strong tie in there, but this isn't actually mentioned to any great degree. And I think some of the language and some of the terminology, although it expresses the same concepts as in Buddhism and Hinduism, and to a certain extent, other religions like Christianity and even Gnosticism as well, which isn't a religion actually, but it's what I've read about Gnosticism, that also, echoes very, very similar themes to this Wingmakers material. And why I'm bringing that up is, I made this YouTube video series, about 5 or 6, 10 or 15 minute videos I made. And then somebody posted a comment going back to my, comments about people watching the channel.
Yes.
And they were pointing out that this Wingmakers material has been altered from when it was first posted on the internet way back in 1998. Now, as it happens, the videos I made, I was actually referring to the 1998 information. And I think the person that sent me this comment hadn't quite twigged that for whatever reason. I think they maybe watched the first couple of minutes and thought, oh, this guy talking about Wingmakers, but does he know that the website changed? And I did know a little bit about that. But basically, you know, from finding that information in this comment, I then went off down another rabbit hole and found a very well-written article which goes into more detail about the Wingmakers and the fact that this website was changed. And like one of the people that claims to be this sort of spiritually advanced, person, who'd he says he put together all this material, and it is, according to him, it's true. He didn't make it all up. But then there was this argument with him and somebody else who says, look, going back to what I was saying a few minutes ago about some of it being true and some of it not being true. This guy who claims to be spiritually advanced argued with this other person because they did an interview with Kerry Cassidy, if you've heard of her. She runs a website called Project Camelot.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. And I've got my own experience with her, direct experience and indirect experience. So, I won't go into that. But anyway, so somebody had gone onto their website and they basically said, the Wingmakers stuff is good, but this bit's wrong and that bit's wrong, and you've got to watch out for this bit. And this other James guy who originally put this together, he got really upset. And he says, look, he wrote to Kerry Cassidy and he says, look, you've got to edit this interview because some of it's wrong. You just got to edit it. You've got to take it down, edit it, and then put it back. So he was basically trying to censor this other person, which if you read the principles, of this Wingmakers material, that again, you think, well, why would he want to do that? If he's being totally honest, that should just come out in the material. It's fair enough to say, look, you're not telling the truth, but why did he ask to get this other person censored off this other website? Why didn't he just ask them to put up a response?
Exactly. Yeah.
And say, look, that bit's wrong. That bit's wrong. What this person says is wrong. Why did he ask for the censorship? That's where I have a problem. When you're trying to impose yourself on somebody's freedom of speech, even if it's harmful to, or apparently harmful to you,
it could literally just be he misinterpreted or misinterpretation of the text.
No, well, I don't think so. I mean, this guy's clearly highly intelligent and highly, if you read some of the materials, it's it's really, really good stuff. It's really well written, and the quality of this material has come from a very advanced mind or group of minds. If you get into it, particularly this glossary which I was reading out in the videos, it describes basically a lot of stuff that's been going on now. And this was written in 1998, like this glossary thing that from the Wingmakers materials, essentially predicts the creation of YouTube about probably nearly 10 years before it actually got created. And they call it OLIN. I forget what the acronym means. And if you read through it all, and it talks about the difference between the different ways that people are becoming enlightened. And some people are doing it through, and I should get the actual material up, but they're basically differentiating between like a personal transformation and one which is based on a saviorship model. In other words, Jesus is going to come and save us.
Okay.
And it basically puts all of that like into one paragraph, like 100 words, and it describes precisely basically the difference between your regular things like Abrahamic religions, and the ones which are more based around expanding your consciousness and looking inwards, into the inner self and all of that, and discovering the inner self and all of that stuff. And you read this and you think somebody who's written this, they clearly have a very, very good understanding of spiritual topics and the different types of spirituality which have been developed and expressed, in Hinduism, Buddhism,
Confucianism as well, I guess.
Well, you might count that. I don't know much about that, but that's probably similar.
Because it's more dealing with the self. It's not necessarily externalizing a deity of sorts. It's more about developing self and the consciousness and destroying ego as well.
Yeah, and that's it. And that's one of the themes that recurs in the Wingmakers material. And it talks about, getting in touch with first source or primary source, which is essentially, the core nature of the universe. And I think they claim that's kind of unknowable. And this then ties in, I think, if I'm correct, with the Buddhist concept of Dharma, which is the concept of everything. But they don't call it that in Wingmakers. I think they give more detail about what it actually is and what it's not, and why you can't actually totally, express it or whatever. And it concisely describes all of that in just a few hundred words,
And what area of the world was this information sort of coming out of?
Well, allegedly, you see, what they were doing this archaeological dig in South America, and it's actually the whole story, if it's true, is set in Chaco Canyon. And then it links in with the Anasazi Indians, I think, which were in that area in that time. So it is, they do give a specific geographical location. And then there's also a novel which goes along with this material as well, the Wingmakers novel, which I read over a couple of weeks. And again, it could just be a made-up story, it's just somebody with a vivid imagination, and it's some of it's a bit boring, parts of it. It's not, as a novel, it's not particularly outstanding even for science fiction.
Okay.
But there's certain themes in it where you think, wow, that does have a ring of truth to it, and certain parts of it. And it starts off, for example, by talking about the Roswell crash. In fact, does it mention that specifically? I think it doesn't mention Roswell specifically, but it does talk about, flying saucer crashes in the 40s. And this led to them setting up a special group to deal with this stuff, and then they were dealing with live aliens from some crashes. And that's where it sort of starts, in this novel. And so that, again, that piqued my interest because I've done a fair bit of research into that. And I'm quite convinced that, yes, Roswell was real. Yes, an extraterrestrial object of some kind crashed, bodies were recovered, at least one of them survived, and all of that stuff.
I would say everybody who has looked into that, even if it was just maybe for an hour, the general consensus is, as you said, something definitely,
yes,
and bodies were recovered, kind of thing. Whether those grainy footage, which are very questionable, are indeed correct, I don't know, but definitely there is documented evidence. There's witnesses, there's statements. That's
right. And I mean, you've only got to read the books by people like Stanton Friedman and Don Smith and Don Ledger, I think is their names. They've sort of been interviewing the Roswell witnesses for decades. I think they've got about 600 witnesses to various parts of the events. And I think they've been able to identify that the stories are mostly consistent. And again, there could be different reasons for the inconsistencies because different people have seen slightly different things. One of the very interesting parts of that, now we're talking about Roswell, is this so-called morphing metal. There are many stories of the morphing metal, and some of them go into the 1960s. One of the ones that I tend to quote is this guy called Jerry Croth, who's a lecturer. I think he's a lecturer in like psychology or something. And he's made some good YouTube videos, very straightforward and accessible and very concise. And he talked about when he was giving a class in about, he's quite old now, I think he's like 70s, 80s. He was giving a class in a college in the 1960s. And this young student came up to him and said, I want to show you this, sir, And it was a piece of the Roswell morphing metal. And he didn't realize this at the time. But that's like 20 years after the original events, more or less, and it's the same story.
Yeah.
So again, that to me adds credibility to that event actually happening when you get such a diverse story. And if you listen to this guy, I don't think he's just making it up to get YouTube clicks or anything like that.
Exactly. I mean, you can almost work those kind of people out straight away, or someone who may be just a little bit mentally unhinged, kind of thing.
Kind of. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, generally, you can spot I can see the validity in this. I can see the truth. Yeah, the way they're presenting themselves, it doesn't seem like it's rehearsed. But
that's right. And going back to what I was saying about people sending me links and how that sends you down the rabbit hole. In following up that discussion of was the Wingmakers material changed, I found another article written by somebody called Wes Penray, who I'd never heard of, and I've been looking at this stuff for nigh on 20 years now. And this Wes Penray had also done a really interesting article about the Wingmakers material. And it was that article where he pointed out this thing with the Project Camelot being, asked to edit this interview with the woman who said that some of the Wingmakers material was false. It's got all of that in it. And then it talks, for example, about a bit more of what's in the Wingmakers material, which they talk about this race called the Animus. Now, the Animus, they're a race essentially of biological robots. So they don't have a soul, right? And they've been plotting for years to, kind of take over the Earth. And they're basically, I say, biological robots. They don't have a soul. They don't care really what happens to beings that they interact with. Mm-hmm. And this then ties in, for example, with the stories, and you can call them stories if you want. I think they're actually, I didn't believe this at first, but I think there's a lot more truth in them than I originally thought. There is a story that President Eisenhower met with at least two alien races in the mid-1950s.
Oh, of course, yes.
That, made these agreements with one of them, and one was going to give them technology.
Yeah.
And then they said, look, well, in exchange for that technology, you can abduct people, and do this research as long as you tell us, who you're going to abduct. And, there's been some corroboration of this, of sorts, at least. People like Dan Sherman, who's written this Above Black book that I read a few years ago. He says that he was actually telepathically handling the coordinates for alien abductions that were coming through to him. That's what he realized that after, I think, a year of being on this project. So he essentially partly corroborates this idea that the aliens were given access or permission to abduct people, and what the Wingmaker story then claims, you see, is that they're abducting people because they want to manipulate people's genetics so that they can create a hybrid being of the Animus, or then the Animus, I suppose, are synonymous with the Greys, the alien Greys, and their variants. They can create a hybrid being which will allow them to put a soul into, to make them into a soul carrier, because that's what they want to do.
I've heard this before, but not in using those terms. I'm just trying.
Right. So what they were basically saying is that that the Animus have essentially been infiltrating the power structures, and this process accelerated according to some of the Wingmaker materials in 2011, which is a very interesting year, really, when you think about it. I mean, that's the year before 2012.
Exactly. Major year.
Yeah, and if when you get into some of these topics about raising your consciousness and so forth, which I think you talk about on looking at some of your other podcasts, ways that can be done, and ways that make that easier and stuff. And then you consider everything that's been going on, particularly in the last, since the COVID scam started, which, if that's not the biggest effort ever to depress and reverse people's, evolving consciousness, I don't know what is. And then, of course, according to certain people, you can throw in the genetics, when some people are saying that, you've got these mRNA and these vaccines, and
it's questionable.
That was going to manipulate people's genes. Is that what's going to happen? I'm not sure, because I've heard conflicting information about this. Certainly it's not discussed in the shame stream. In the alternative media, people have said, oh yeah, that's definitely happened. We know that people's DNA is being altered and blah, blah, blah. And then other people in the alternative media said, well, actually, I think we can say that the mRNA is in the vaccines, in some of them, but we can't actually prove the real effect that this is having in terms of altering people's genetics,
Have you heard the stuff about the prion crystals being formed?
Ooh, I've heard something, but again, not with any kind of, and not a massive amount of substance to it. But
of course, yeah, I've heard it a few times, and I've tried to have a look to try and verify it, and it's difficult. It's difficult depending on what search engine you're using as well. That's even more tricky. Obviously, not using Google is the first thing.
That's it. I mean, there's various elements to what's in the vaccines. Of course, there's the one that you mentioned, which I think I've not heard as much. There's the mRNA. There is then, of course, the self-assembling antennae and things that are in there with this nanotechnology, which is in the vaccines.
Yes.
And there's some interesting videos about that, which I'm not sure what to make of. Of course, some people have said that they've, picked up Bluetooth transmissions, which I don't think is true. Or rather,
of course, I think I've seen that, and they've actually found the IP address of some of the nano.
Right. And I think that is just devices which are, left switched on, and people are picking up those, and they're not realizing that they're there, because I honestly don't think they would make a Bluetooth transmitter and put it in a jab. I mean, that would just be too easy to detect for, and I mean, Richard D. Hall, he did a very good study of this, and he came to the conclusion that you can't. There wasn't a Bluetooth transmitter. There was something that looked like it in certain instances, but in his tests, it always turned out to be a transmitter which wasn't properly masked, and the equipment was picking it up when you wouldn't have expected it to, that sort of thing.
And if you think about it logically, if there was to employ that sort of technology, it wouldn't be at a level where consumers would be able to pick up that signal.
Probably not. I tend to think that if it really was in there, it'd be some type of more advanced black world technology, and like you say, we probably wouldn't even be able to detect it. Again, whatever technology is being used, if it is being used, that is, hasn't affected us. At least as far as we can tell, it hasn't affected us. We're still having this conversation about these things, as are many other people. So whatever plans they've got haven't been 100% successful. There is still a resistance movement, which is, active, basically.
And steadily growing, I think.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
More and more people at varying stages of that slumber are now saying, wait a minute, especially, and this is a good way to segue from what we're talking about into the quote unquote breaking news in regards to our, and I'll say it in air quotes, Prime Minister. Like, a year ago, oh my God, but BJ, he's the best person out here. He's the best prime minister. Look what he's done. He's locked everyone down to keep us safe. And, he had it and he was still working and all this stuff. And then fast forward a year, there seems to be some kind of improprieties regarding, parties and this and that.
Yes.
And then,
I mean, it does make you wonder, and of course you then, yes, he's resigned. I think today he was resigning, and a lot of jokes are going around on Facebook and stuff. And I've sent some of these jokes myself, and I haven't followed the circumstances of it hardly at all. But other than what you just said about comparing him to a year ago, and it does seem that certain things are falling apart. But then again, of course, I saw one of the other cartoons that was put up where it's a picture of Klaus Schwab, the leader of the World Economic Forum, and then he's got a picture of him holding Bojo as a puppet, and the head's dropped off Bojo, and Klaus Schwab saying, "Get me another one," and which I rather liked.
Yes.
And, again, people look at the World Economic Forum, and this again is a good segue back to what we were talking about, because I recently saw another interview with Klaus Schwab's advisor, or edited bits of an interview, and I forget the name of this guy. He's got a bald head. He's probably about 45, 46.
I think I've seen it as well. Yes, continue, sir.
Yeah, he's Klaus Schwab's advisor, and he's talking about we need to get rid of God in society and hide the body.
Yes.
And he's talking about there being no point to life, and he's talking about hacking people as if they're, a computer.
Exactly.
So we're then back to this idea of machine intelligence, a soulless being, which is how the animus are described. And if you were to say that the animus have infiltrated some of the top organizations in the world, just as a joke, well, looking at this guy, you think he's working for them, would be my characterization of that. And then, of course, we've got all the Elon Musk thing with AI is going to take over the world. Some people think Elon Musk is just a mouthpiece for, the agenda players. Some people think he's gone over to the good side, and then you got the whole QAnon narrative and all that side of things, which I've done a little bit of research into. And
Andrew, I couldn't bring myself to the QAnon. A lot of people were pushing that information, and I thought some of it sounds a bit credible, but like the deep state, like the dark part of the military generals and Trump got together, and what sense does that even make?
Yes, I know what you mean. And I think some of the disclosures were significant, and the timing and the way that they put the QAnon post together, it was quite sophisticated. It wasn't, to me, it wasn't your average psychological operation. There was a lot of work gone into it and a lot of technical planning, and it did seem to involve Trump. And I think the certain signals that he was giving, or apparently giving, did seem to be, the QAnon explanation seemed to be the strongest one. But of course, when it came to the election, it all fell apart, really, for me. Because they were saying, oh, well, he's going to get in, he's going to get reelected. That didn't happen. Then they said, oh, well, yeah, Joe Biden's got in the White House, but when Kamala Harris had that Bible, she had a book on top of it. So when she swore the oath, she wasn't actually touching the Bible. Therefore, it wasn't a real oath. Therefore, it's a fake.
Thank you.
Regime in the White House, and Trump's going to come back in like in 4 weeks when they fully expose themselves as pedos and whatnot. Trump's going to get back in, and it's going to be all wonderful. That didn't happen.
No.
And then it got to the election vote, didn't it? And they said, oh, well, they're going to have a recount. The electoral college is going to throw it out, and Biden's going to be out on his ear. And that didn't happen either. So we had about 4 or 5 of those things, I think, in fairly rapid succession, which didn't come true. And that, of course, I think killed off a lot of it. And I know that there were people like Mark Devlin, they were following this Charlie Freak guy. Now, when I listened to him, I was interested. But then when I went to look at some of his own videos, I didn't get a good feeling about him. And then you had somebody like Simon Parks promoting this, QAnon narrative as well. And I met Simon Parks, I've interacted with him, and that guy's just not reliable. He's not a reliable source of information. And so again,
red flags.
The people that are pushing this, these are not reliable people, but that said, there are some other interesting things going on, such as what we've seen today. Who is going to get put in next? Maybe it's a case of the devil that better the devil than the devil you don't, kind of thing. But wait, what got to see? Are they going to put Rishi Sunak in, or somebody like that, who is completely World Economic Forum kind of immersed? Are they going to put somebody like him in? I don't know, because I don't care, because all the Tory MPs, all however many, 400 of them, they should have resigned 2 years ago.
Exactly.
My way of thinking. And anyone that didn't should have been put in prison, for my way of thinking, along with a lot of the police chiefs that were supporting all the scam from day one.
This is it. And remember, Andrew, we are police by consent, remember?
Yes, that's right.
So that's the get out clause. That is the get out clause right there.
Yes, indeed. But there were some interesting things happened, like Cressida Dick. She resigned, didn't she? And so it's almost like she was booted out, and there wasn't a lot of explanation about that. And yes, we've seen more paedophile revelations. We saw the Prince Andrew thing coming out, which of course nothing's really happened about. But he did do that interview, which to me, why did he do that interview kind of thing? Why did that information come out? Were they really rubbing our noses in it?
I think it's that, as you've said, because that you couldn't even script such a terrible interview.
Indeed. You'd think that from that something's got to give, but apparently nothing has really. At least not on the surface. No. And I think this is what happens with this QAnon and the similarities. People are going, oh yeah, but there's all this stuff going on in the background, and you think, oh great, that'd be really good if we've got these benevolent aliens or benevolent spiritual beings, coming working behind the scenes and blowing up all these underground bases and getting rid of all these, the swamp people,
Exactly. Do you remember all of the messages that you was probably getting on WhatsApp and the links about the biggest one I kept on getting a lot was, I think it was during lockdown. I think it was the first stage or maybe the second stage. It was like a video of like a subpoena or some kind of judgment. And it was just like a huge name of lists on there: Hillary Clinton, Obama, this and this.
Yeah, I did see that, some of that. And it claimed they'd all been shipped off to Guantanamo and executed. Yeah, I got a few of those.
It's it's very disheartening that clearly that you've got non-GOs who are involved in creating like Cambridge Analytica, creating such propaganda and putting it out. And then you've got people in their own home saying, okay, what can I do? I can take this clip from 2 years ago or even 10 years ago, put it in a different continent and a different place and say, look, this is what's happening now. And then it spreads like wildfire.
That's right. And there's a chap called Chris Hampton who's made some good films. He kind of made one related to the QAnon narrative, you know, and he shows how on the one hand, Trump was saying that Hillary should be in prison, but then I think like the next day or the week previous, he was at this dinner with her and he's singing her praises in some sort of way, and she stood right next to him and they're laughing and joking together, you know. And that's quite, you know, revelatory when you see that, you know, to sort of make you wonder about this QAnon narrative and, you know, whether what sort of validity it has, you know.
And many people did highlight the fact that, you know, I think Trump, wasn't he one of the biggest donors for the Trump political sort of campaign and stuff?
Who was, sorry?
Trump.
Was a donor for which political?
For the Clintons.
Oh, right. Yeah, it's quite possible. I didn't see that one, but, you know, that's possible. Although, of course, Trump is Republican and Clinton was Democrat. Not that it really means anything anymore. But, yeah, I mean, that may well be the case, you know, so.
But I guess as people have tried to explain that, yeah, you know, that was in the, you know, in the 80s and the 90s, and he's grown as a person now. And that's why, you know, and that may be all in well true. But as you say, in the public eye, when it comes to that, this is the stance, but behind closed doors at these meetings, it's singing the praise.
Yeah. You know, I mean, for me, there are other things which, you know, if somebody is really truthful, then I for example, would say, well, look, you know, read Dr. Judy Wood's book about 9/11, and then when you've read that, tell the world about it. You know, tell the world how the World Trade Center was really destroyed. Mm-hmm. Now, Trump, some people were alleging that he was going to do something like that because he said in one of his pre-election meetings, is, you know, you're going to find out who knocked down the towers. You know, I think if you search for that quote, you'll find a video of him saying that in like 2015 or early in 2016 or something, before he was elected. But that's not good enough. You know, I say to anybody that wants to could tell the truth about what happened to the World Trade Center. And why I'm specifically focusing on that is it's, you know, it really does affect so much else.
It's the catalyst to all of the change that we see now.
Now, I'm going to try and read a quote that I wrote a few years ago, and I have a particular reason for reading this out, if I can find it. And what happened was, you see, now I think I've already referenced this, and it relates to what I just said. I've written, several books, and two of them are about 9/11, right? And then what I did with these books, I made them into audio books. Now, the first 9/11 book, which is called 9/11 Finding the Truth, that was very kindly made into an audio book for me by a very kind lady in the US called Cindy Laverty, right? Mm-hmm. But in the second one that I wrote about 9/11, I just used a robot voice to read it out into an MP3 file.
Yeah.
Right. And I put that audio onto a YouTube video, and it just has like a graphic sound to light pattern playing along with it, so that you can make it into a YouTube video.
Yes.
And fairly recently, within I think the last 3 months, because what I did was I put each chapter of the book into an audio readout, and that went in a separate YouTube video.
Yes.
One chapter of that was deleted by YouTube within the last 3 months. One chapter, and it's just a robot voice, right, reading out my text, and there are no images in this book, in this video, I mean, right? So
that's the power of the old boob tube, as I refer to it as.
So what I'm going to do is, I think the reason why they deleted this was because I've pointed out exactly why 9/11 is so important, right? So I'm going to read this.
Okay.
And people can go and read this book at CheckTheEvidence.com. You can download it for free. I think there's definitely a PDF file, and I might have even put an EPUB file there, which some ebook readers handle better. So in the introduction, I've written about the being a follow-up volume of 9/11 research that I've done. And I've got the title in that chapter, What 9/11 Truth Are We Holding? So this is the second book, which is called 9/11 Holding the Truth. So in other words, people that haven't read this, what's he on about? What truth is being held? So my concept with this title was that we'd found the truth about what happened to the World Trade Center. We can stop looking for that now because we know what happened to it.
Yes.
So we don't need to debate that anymore. It'd be like debating whether we're using Zoom to have this meeting. Really, we don't need to debate that because it's obvious that we are. We both know that. That's starting from a known point. Mm-hmm. So this is not a theory or anything, in what we've talked about 9/11, it's Dr. Judy Wood's book is not a theory, it's a set of evidence. So following on from that, I put, to explain the title of this book, I want to point out the established facts about the destruction of the World Trade Center, which were compiled into a website by April 2008 and later into Dr. Judy Wood's textbook, Where Did the Towers Go?, which I abbreviate to WTTG. The truth is as follows. And this is not a theory, this is not speculation. On 11th of September 2001, the WTC towers did not burn up, nor did they slam to the ground. About 85 to 90% of the buildings turned to dust in midair. A total of 7 WTC buildings were either destroyed outright on the day or their remains removed in the following months or years. Whatever crashed into the WTC towers did not cause their destruction. The towers underwent a type of destruction that had never been seen in the white world before. The destruction was the result of some type of energy weapon which operated on principles not recognized in white world science. A Category 3 hurricane, which was called Erin, had movements coincident with the events of 9/11 and was closest to New York City at about 8 a.m. on 11th of September 2001, which of course was just before all these events unfolded. And then I go on to write, if one is to accept these truths, then one must also accept that there is a separate power elite group that both possesses such advanced directed free energy technology and the means to deploy it. Not only that, as I have been documenting for over 10 years, it can cover up these things to the point that almost no one recognizes its massive deception for what it is. But why do I say free energy technology? It is because from observing the process of destruction of the WTC towers, we can see a catastrophic change taking place. That is, to tear apart steel beams and other materials and turn them to dust using a process already recognized by the mainstream thinking would require an enormous amount of energy. In a conventional process, this energy would perhaps come from some type of explosion, burning, laser, or electrical discharge. However, all of these processes would have an enormous amount of associated heat, and such heat was not seen or felt on 9/11. Hence, this energy release or change either came from thin air or from within the materials which made up the World Trade Center. This is the big secret, and some clues to what the secret is can be found in the evidence collected in the Where Did the Towers Go book and in Dr. Judy Wood's presentations. And then I say, how you go on from there. And I talk about the energy cover-up on that, going on from that.
Yes.
So that's the only chapter of that book that was deleted, right? So I think, and I'm not, maybe blowing my own trumpet here, but I think I nailed it. I think I nailed why they wanted to delete that video, because once you go through all of that, everything changes. Right, you've got as much free energy as you need.
Yeah.
You've got the climate change scam is completely neutralized. You've got the terrorism scam is neutralized, and then you have to accept that there is a separate, undisclosed group that did 9/11, and they're able to influence, the alternative media, the mainstream media, maybe directly influence people's state of mind individually to keep all of this covered up and keep the deception going. And they've done this now for over 20 years, right? So that can be neutralized at a stroke with what I've just described there. Once, of course, you understand that that is true, and that's what you need to understand. So that's a challenge for anyone to remove what I've just stated from the realm of theory to the realm of knowledge and understanding, okay? Yes. Everyone has the opportunity to do that, and you don't need to spend any money. All you need to do is spend time, because all of that information, which lead you to those conclusions is on the drjudywood.com website, and it's on my website, right? So, all of this, everything else to me is just a sideshow.
Yeah, I totally agree. But the thing is, as you pointed out, you don't need to pay financially with fiat currency for this.
Correct.
But it would seem that the populi has been socialized and programmed into, I would rather part with this fiat money, which I'm giving my energy in exchange for, rather than using my energy and concentration of my mind to actually free everything that goes along with that.
Yeah. And I mean, the point about what I've been doing in the last, really since about 2007, 2008, is to provide people with a toolkit or a library, if you will, to establish that what I've just said there is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And I feel like confident in saying that, going back to the reasons that I said about earlier on, in that a lot of people have looked at this information now, and a lot of these people are intelligent, they are wise, they are knowledgeable, and they know, certain stuff that they know more about it than I do. And none of them have challenged the basic statements that I've made there to any meaningful degree. Right, that information has been available, most of it in Dr. Wood's book. That was published in 2011. So that's 11 years since it was published now, nearly 12, getting on for 12. So that's a substantial period of time for that information to be challenged, and it really hasn't. The best that people can do is ridicule it and pretend that certain things are not covered in the book, like, for example, the Architects and Engineers Group. That many people mentioned in relation to 9/11, they pretend that Dr. Judy Wood doesn't talk about bombs in the building in the book. And Richard Gage, who was the leader of that group up until about 6 months ago, he claims that Dr. Judy Wood doesn't address that evidence in her book. That's just an outright lie. So the only way they can deal with this information is to lie about it. And again, we're talking about the alternative media there, not the mainstream.
I know.
This is not discussed anywhere in the mainstream. And in fact, if you try and start a web page about Dr. Judy Wood or her book, you'd be lucky if it lasts 24 hours. If you try and start a Wikipedia page, I should say, if you try and start a Wikipedia page about this, or maybe even one of my books, it'll be gone. It'll be gone within 48 hours. It's real-time censorship.
Yes, and it's not just potentially AI that's doing this. You've got people on the ground thinking.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I think it's both. Yeah, exactly. So the I try and sort of emphasize this at every opportunity I get, because I really want people to understand for themselves and own this, And as I might have said the last time I spoke with you, people don't know who I am. I could be anybody. So it's important to go and independently observe, and observe is a key word, what I've told you. Go back to the Internet Archive, look at the 9/11 news coverage that's stored there. Look at the videos of the towers turning to dust, and there are quite a few of them. Go and read the witness accounts from the firefighters that, for example, will show you and tell you that the air tanks that they were using to help people, rescue them from the towers, they were exploding on the back of the trucks. These air tanks were exploding on the back of the trucks, folks. Do you think they planted explosives in the air tanks on the back of the trucks? For those that think they blew up the towers with explosives, do you really? So things like that. The detail is important. The devil is in the detail, as they say.
Yes.
And really, and this is nowhere more true than in the destruction of the World Trade Center. And then you get into, I know I'm going off on one here, but
no, go for it, sir. Go for it, because it's all part of the plan.
It is. Then you get into things like the consciousness aspects. For example, then you get into the occult ritual side of things, and that's another aspect that people talk about in relation to 9/11. So, for example, when did it happen? 9/11, 11/9. These are occult numbers. How many floors did the World Trade Center have? 110 or 111 if you count the top floor. If you looked at the buildings on the horizon, what did they look like? Number 11.
Exactly.
What was opposite the World Trade Center? The Millennium Hotel. Still there today.
Yes.
So when did the event happen? It was the first year of the new millennium, because there was no year zero. So according to, the whoever who did this, 2001 was the first year of the new millennium. Isn't that a coincidence, folks? And then you find out, for example, if you go and look at the old version of the Millennium Hotel's website, what was the shape of the Millennium Hotel based on? It was based on the monolith.
The monolith, yes.
2001 film.
You can't make it up, Andrew.
Can't make it up because it's true. It's true. So, and the occult rituals and practices what are they for? They're to affect people's consciousness and subconscious. And what's been going on since then to accelerate? It's been going on for a long time before 2001, obviously, as people would rightly pick me up on. But the process seems to have accelerated
highly.
Since 2001, it's culminated perhaps, or seems to have come to some type of culmination point. In the last in 2020. What's 2020? Reduce that. It's a 22 year, isn't it? It's a 22 year. When was it announced? The pandemic, 11th of March, 3/11. Come on, folks.
And
this is their signature.
Yeah, it's all in the numbers. It's all in the numbers.
A lot of it's in the numbers. I agree. This can be taken to an extreme, but certainly certain things seem to become obvious. So, so this is what we're dealing with, folks. We're dealing with spiritual predators that some people call them. You're being preyed upon. Your conscious energy is being manipulated and used against you, and you're being oppressed and suppressed by another consciousness, right? So, one of my criticisms, going back to looking at some of the Wingmakers materials and stuff, is that they don't talk about other consciousnesses that are trying to predate on you, or trying to prey on you. And not much anyway. And I think people need to be aware that this is going on. And as Leonard Horowitz said, we're in a state of bio-spiritual warfare, and never was that more accelerated with COVID. I mean, if that wasn't bio-warfare, on the biggest scale ever seen, since ever, then I don't know what else to call it. It was bio-warfare on a mass scale, hundreds of millions across the world in every country. Were attacked and abused, in my estimation, and it's still going on. It's still going on.
Still going on. Still
every day.
Going on. Yes.
So
to me, I don't understand how these beings can sleep comfortably at night knowing what they're doing. I'm wondering even if they're even consciously aware, and if
I don't think they are.
No, I don't. They can't be, because anyone with any
they don't have a soul.
Yeah,
they don't have a soul. You can call them godless or soulless beings. And I think they are pretty much running the show presently. And I'm not a person who talks about the Bible and stuff like that, but you can as I'm sure other guests have talked about, you can see the flipping parallels. With the devil taking over the world and all of that talk, you can certainly see the parallels, And I remember Bill Hicks doing that talk where he says, all the people that are talking peace and light and love, like Gandhi or whoever, or John Lennon, what happens to them? They get killed, and then the demons run amok.
Yes.
And that was the phrase that Bill Hicks used back in one of his talks. And the demons running amok, that's been happening since 9/11, Did they open a portal? Did those events using that advanced technology open up some type of dimensional portal, which let more of these beings through to make the world even more, godless and soulless and oppressive and whatnot? I mean, I don't know. It's just a supposition. But hey, it really made me think when I started thinking about and exploring some of those areas, and thought, wow. Maybe this devil thing and whatnot, maybe it's not so silly after all. I used to think it was a bit silly, but
Angie, you're touching on so many things here. I mean, I think many people, especially over the last even 5 years, I would even go to that small number, have re-examined their view on the manuscript, the Bible, and said, wait a minute, I need to rethink this, because I can see it. I've got the eyes to see, and I've got the ears to hear. Like, come on, like, Whether you go the step further and really embrace it and go further with it, that's another thing, and that's your own personal choice and your own personal journey.
Exactly.
But you'd be an idiot not to say, wait a minute, this was written how long ago?
Yeah, I mean, you can look at the sort of various predictions, and certainly while some of them have failed and some of them are clearly not true, and you can interpret some of them in multifarious ways, there are certain ones which really you think that seems to be pretty close to what's actually been going on, and you get some pretty accurate predictions. And the other thing which I rewatched recently while we're on this sort of theme, and I'm sure many of your listeners have watched this more than once, it's the John Carpenter film called They Live.
Oh gosh,
right?
Classic.
Yes, indeed. And that again illustrates plainly, I think, what's happening with people right now. And of course, what's the theme in that film? That a race of aliens are invisible.
Yes.
And they've taken over planet Earth without anybody really realizing it. And we've got a mixture of humans and aliens. You can't tell them apart with your normal level of consciousness. But of course, once you get the glasses on, you can see it as plain as day, And there's a really interesting bit of dialogue in that, which I think most people have overlooked. And I only really noticed this myself in the last sort of couple of years, because I've actually got a talk on the internet, and people can go and have a listen to it if they wish. It's called Infinite Energy, but Not for the Masses. And it kind of expands on some of the energy themes that I touched on in relation to 9/11 and whatnot, and some other areas which are related. And that's on the Global BEM, Global Breakthrough Energy Movement channel. And it was done in 2012. And that talk, I think it's had 200,000 views or something on their channel, something like that. And I cover a lot of stuff in there, which I think is relevant to this. And why I mention that is I end the talk with this They Live clip. And in that, there's this scene near the end of the film where the heroes have broken into the underground base, or not broken into, but they've been transported there by one of the aliens' teleportation devices. And they're walking around, and there's this dinner going on with the power elite are being given the information by the alien, right? So this guy stood in front of a lectern and he's saying, oh, we couldn't have done this without you. And each of you that have participated and given us support have seen your annual profits increase by an average of 39%. And then what we can tell you is that we're really grateful that you've helped us with this project of multi-dimensional expansion. And this work should be complete by 2025. And this film was in 1988, folks.
Yes.
So that date struck me as quite interesting. And this idea of multi-dimensional expansion. And even in some of the opening words of the film, I think within about the first 5 minutes of dialogue, they're talking about human consciousness being manipulated by this beaming technology that's and they're jamming it. They're coming through on the TV screen. They're talking about human consciousness, which again is what I've just been talking about. So, understand this, folks, that yes, your consciousness, you're in control of it and stuff, but be aware that there's a very strong likelihood and possibility that not only can your consciousness be influenced and controlled by TV, by newspapers, by social media, there is also more subtle technology which may involve some type of beaming that could, I think, also is involved. Now, this might involve some form of microwaves, some type of phase conjugated microwave beam or something, or it could be being done. Some people argue, of course, it's been done through the mobile phone network. I think that's very, very difficult to prove. But, who knows what the effect of these 5G signals, there's this very sort of high frequency pulsing, which is what apparently damages the cells. You've got this pulsing going on at 40 and 26 billion times a second. That's 40 and 26 gigahertz. Very, very, very high frequency pulsing. What does that do to a cell? What does that do to your brain? What does that do to your consciousness? I think these questions are worth at least thinking about, even if we can't necessarily answer them in the way that we would like to. And I think some of the answers are not able to be answered scientifically without a lot of advanced instrumentation. And therefore we have a kind of gap into which people are putting all these various assumptions and statements, which some of which may be true and some of which probably aren't. So, that in of itself is a way of, changing your consciousness, that you've got this uncertainty in all of this, which can lead you down in a state of fear and stuff. But I think sometimes you've just got to be happy with uncertainty,
Yeah, totally. Live in the moments, as I've been saying recently, live in the moments and plan for the future. That's the only thing that we've got control of. That's the only thing we can control is ourselves, our immediate family. And sometimes even that's difficult enough. Never mind trying to control the wider populi. If we can all think as individual cells and work as individual cells, as a mass, doing all the right thing collectively, that's where the effective change takes place.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think it's important that people realize the different ways in which they can be manipulated and might be being manipulated. And this, to me, goes across various areas which some people don't think about, both in terms of, obviously the mainstream, the shame stream, and all of that, but also being remotely influenced, and you look at some of the work that they were doing, for example, in the 1970s with this Operation Stargate, or the Psychic Spies program. And that information, that became public in the 1980s. I remember first hearing about this, SRI program with Russell Targ and, Joe McMonigal and all those guys, Paul Smith and Pat Price and all those guys. That all came out in the early 80s and has been doing the rounds ever since, and still is doing the rounds. But what is less, I think, talked about is what they apparently went on to after remote viewing is remote influence. How can you influence people remotely? And if you're wondering why people like Boris Johnson have been acting so strangely, particularly in the last 2 years, in fact, all of the leaders of nearly all the countries have been acting very, very strangely. Could it be to do with some type of remote influence technology? Or did they have some other more conventional type of brainwashing when they went through this global leaders program in the World Economic Forum? Were they all in a room and then somebody flicked a switch, or did somebody put something in the coffee or the water or something? Who knows? But
it could be a combination of all. I mean, you've also got the direct to skull technology, which ties in with the gang stalking phenomenon, which is a lot more prevalent in America than it is over here.
Right.
And I would say that I would imagine that there's a lot more of that stuff taking place here, but it's not being highlighted.
Yeah. So, it's worth exploring some of these areas and seeing what you can make of all of this. And there's books by people like Walter Bauart, who's no longer with us. He talks about mind control. And there's couple of books by Neil Sanders, although I can't recommend his later work, but the books by Neil Sanders on mind control, a pretty good introduction.
1 and 2, that is, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And there's Kathy O'Brien, Transformation of America book. I think you can get that as a free PDF. There's quite a lot of material out there. And then the other stories like I think Fiona Baker, the Australian woman who tells a story of meeting Nicole Kidman's dad, years and years ago. That to me is a credible story.
Very.
And if you look, for example, at this, what I found shocking was this bioethics committee, which was set up by the Obama administration in 2011. And they had a number of hearings, actually, and very few people seem to know about this. And I was shocked because they had a couple of hearings, and they're on YouTube, I think. If you search for Bioethics Committee 2011 on YouTube, I think it's still there. People are just coming to these public hearings, coming up to the mic and talking about how they've been targeted, and they've had their lives ruined.
Wow!
But with voices in their head, and cold sweats at night, and not being able to sleep for months and months because they've had their dreams interfered with, all kinds of stuff like that, And
now you're saying it, I think I may have seen that one of those, and it was like, as you say, it was like a round of people just constantly just flowing up, that exactly. So and that was a government
public consultation, apparently, and that's what kind of shocked me. It's not some coast to coast, alternative media broadcast. This is like government people openly in public writing this stuff down on a notepad while these people are, recording them on a video camera while they're actually describing their accounts, and it's pretty shocking stuff, to think this could be going on in a supposedly free and democratic society.
Well, it throws into question, you've got all of these safe units and mental health places. Like, I know that a lot of the people, not a lot, some of the people in there are not mentally ill and should not be there. They've been misdiagnosed. But then you've got people who potentially are hearing voices, but it's not because they've got an imbalance, quote unquote, as the medical profession says, with the chemicals in their brain. Right. It's that they're being targeted by whoever. This kind of, it's terrible.
That's it. The only way that the mainstream or the shame stream has to explain some of what you just said is chemical imbalance. They can't talk about paranormal phenomena, remote influence, psychic phenomena, psychotronics, microwave beaming technology. They can't talk about any of that because that is all conspiracy theory according to them, or just it's never been proven to exist. And that, of course, we know is just false.
Totally false. The most they'll touch is the frequencies that they used to emit in in the sort of shopping areas to get rid of young children and stuff, teenagers.
I haven't heard of that particular one, but I've heard of similar ones. Yeah. And then there was talk about how, for example, when we had the Greenham Common nuclear missile protest, the women at Greenham Common in the 1980s, they apparently were subjected to some sort of microwaving technology or something as an experiment to see if their behavior could be influenced. I think that was made public, about, 20 years ago or something. I remember reading something about that. And I think that was even covered, in some obscure ITV program related to that, I understand. So, this stuff is out there, and people should be aware that it's real. And, yes. There are more things, in heaven and earth, and, they realize, sort of thing, and just because they have never heard of them doesn't mean to say they're not real,
Totally. Just be a bit more open to the conversation, or even just be open to it, to explore an alternative view. That's all I ask of anybody. I'm not asking anybody to embrace any particular ideology or anything. Just explore and ask the question, why, who, where. Does this make sense?
Exactly. And I recently, just very recently, been reading an interesting PDF, which sort of, that's in one sense what you've just described is kind of a starting point of that book, and it's called The Spiritual Satnav by Noel Hogan. I think it is just spiritualsatnav.com that you can download this free PDF from. And that's kind of like a sort of starts off as a beginner's guide to the sort of thing you were just saying. And what I liked about the introduction to that book is that Noel Hogan explains how he used to be in the RAF, and he was involved in the Gulf War in 1991 in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
And he basically says that now he realizes that he played a part in killing a number of people because he was loading some of the missiles onto some of the planes. And I think it was only after he came back that he kind of had a crisis of conscience and realized that this was what he'd done, and he came out of the RAF, and then I think he went into his own business and stuff. And he had a what you might call a spiritual or conscious awakening.
Yes.
And
through that experience.
Yeah, through that experience. And then he I think his journey started in 2011. And we've mentioned that year earlier on, of course. And he started exploring other stuff and exploring some of the stuff that you and I have just mentioned in the last few minutes, and he sort of goes through how people are, unwilling to accept that they've been manipulated, and the users fill their minds full of, stuff, and a false set of values have been put inside them, in something false, or a set of thoughts which are really not their own. He points that out, and that's of course Neil Sanders' book. So that your thoughts are not your own. That's the title of his book, and this is the theme in Noel Hogan's book, actually, but from a different angle, that you've been fooled into thinking various things and reacting to certain situations in certain ways, so
totally socially programmed.
Yeah, and I think that's quite a good one. If people are new to some of this material, it's fairly down to earth and fairly directly written, and a real human story, which is very clear.
Yes.
And a very clear kind of confrontation of that by the author, which I think anybody would see, what set him on his journey. And going back to what you were saying, I think the key concept is curiosity. If you become curious about something, why has Boris Johnson just resigned? What's behind this? Go deeper. What this guy's talked about, this World Economic Forum. What's that? I need to go and look at that. You've never heard of it. Or what about this numerology thing and 9/11? What's that about? That sounds like a load of nonsense, but maybe I should go and check it out. So we're encouraged not to be curious. Really, I think that happens. I've talked about this in terms of education. By the time that I think children get to the age of about 14, they've lost most of their curiosity, which they may have had before that. Young children.
Unfortunately, Andrew, I would say even earlier than that now.
Yeah, I agree. I'm just sort of using that as a kind of upper limit. But typically, when children go to secondary school, any curiosity they have is generally not encouraged that much, because they've just got to follow a curriculum and get the results and keep the school's reputation by doing well in their SATs and their exams and GCSEs and so forth. The emphasis on that is on that, rather than building a rounded individual that understands the world and has a spiritual perspective, understands how their words can affect others, and how their thoughts and actions are interlinked, and how, for example, what should be taught now and is never taught is sticks and stones may break my bones, but calling names won't hurt me. That concept is now out of fashion, and they're taught that opening your mouth could result in somebody's death, so don't ever open your mouth, ever.
Yeah.
Or something like that. I'm obviously exaggerating to make a point, but that's what they're taught now.
Yeah, face the consequences. You lose your job, you'll lose your opportunities. Yeah.
They're not taught to be strong, to have their own value system, to have their own self-esteem, to the point where whatever that anybody says to them has no effect. That is what they should be being taught, that they are all good people for different reasons, and whatever anyone says about them doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what they say, and it doesn't matter what their race, gender, or sexuality is. That's irrelevant, as long as they are respectful,
indeed,
and kind, passionate to other people. The rest is pretty much irrelevant, really.
It's white noise. It's that in the olden days when after 10 o'clock on the TV used to go black and white with the fuzz. That's what it is.
Yeah, a good analogy. So they should be taught mindfulness, I think, every day. That you're compassionate to others, you listen to others, you try and see their situation, you try and empathize and move forward with that. And then you need to also have discipline and respect.
Yes.
And those are the values which should be instilled. Not this idea that they should be thinking about having a gender change before they are 12 years old.
And given hormone blockers, and in some cases allowing parts of their anatomy to be amputated.
Yes, this is it. And anyone who interferes with that process is put in prison. Which is what apparently they've tried to do in Canada. I think that bill got passed, but it was certainly on the table a year or so ago.
It certainly was.
What is that about? Is that a way of kind of stopping the reproductive effectiveness of the human race and getting rid of people?
I think it's that, and I also think they're trying to create this sort of androgynous sort of being.
Yeah. A grey robot. A grey robot that has no soul, has no individuality, has no independent thought, as it says in the Where They Live film. That's what they're trying to create. The Borg, indeed. That's, again, one of those things that comes up in science fiction. You think, hang on a minute, that's this collective. The resistance is irrelevant. Resistance is
futile.
Futile. Yeah.
Very synchronistic. I mean, the people who view all this stuff, Stranger Things, and all the plethora of all the other movies that are out and series, and it's just entertainment. This is. It's just, I'm just escaping reality. But there's nothing new under the sun, quote unquote. It's a retelling of many different stories in so many different ways, and different titles, places, and veneers are put over the top. But ultimately, we're talking about the same thing all of the time.
Yes, I agree. And we see it in many different forms, and it's been, this sort of manipulation has been going on for, as I've said, thousands of years. But again, it seems to have become more technology oriented and more pervasive now.
Yeah.
Partly because, of course, we live, and we're doing it right now. We're living using technology 24/7 really now, whereas if we go back to the 1970s and 80s, that was much less true than it is now.
Four channels, sir. Four channels.
Four channels, yeah, and not even 24/7 coverage, programming of that on those channels. But there you are.
A simple time.
Yes.
And you thoroughly have enjoyed our conversation as usual.
Me too.
I will make sure I put the links below down in the description, please. I thoroughly, I utterly encourage everybody to click the links, download the books. If you want the physical, obviously, get in touch and place those orders. Study to show thyself approved. It's about you. You have a personal journey. If you've got family, if you've got children as well, it's even more important that you start to not just, things aren't as how they used to be, as love, and leaving it at that. No, let's dig a bit deeper. Why are things so drastically different? Why does everyone have, a similar type of uniform versus having that creativity and freedom to be an individual? Why is there less choice on the high street? Why is the high street shrinking? How is it that you can go from one city to another city and everything looks exactly the same?
That's right.
Like, comment, subscribe, share, tell a friend to tell another friend to jump on the train.